Hello, friends. Welcome to the National Constitution Center and to tonight's convening of America's Town Hall. I am Jeffrey Rosa, the president of this wonderful institution. And let's begin, as always, by inspiring ourselves with the National Constitution Center's mission statement. The National Constitution Center is the only institution in America chartered by Congress to increase awareness and understanding of the Constitution among the American people on a nonpartisan basis. Before we begin, I want to plug some of the great programs that are coming up this month. On November 19th, Professors Maggie Blackhawk, Gregory Dowd, Donald Grindy, and Woody Holton will join a conversation about the influence of indigenous people and tribal governments on the US Constitution. On November 22nd, we're talking about presidential power with Professors Jessica Bullman-Posen, Cy Prakash, and Steve Skonerick. And on November 30th, we're rounding out the month with a wonderful Lincoln program with historian Michael Burlingham, Professor Noah Feldman, and Professor Diana Schaub. All that and more at constitutioncenter.org/debate. We'll be taking your questions throughout the program this evening, so please put them in the Q&A box. And I want to give a special thanks to the Anne Welsh McNulty Institute for Women's Leadership at Villanova University for their great collaboration on a series of discussions, including this one, which is part of the Constitution Center's Women and the Constitution initiative. And I want to also thank the McNulty Foundation for their generous support, which makes these programs possible. They spread so much light, and we're so grateful for our collaboration. And now I will introduce the panelists and then tonight's moderator. Nadia Brown is professor of government, chair of women's and gender studies, and affiliate in the African American Studies program at Georgetown University. She's also an Idle Family Fellow at the McNulty Institute at Villanova. She is the author of the award-winning Sisters in the State House, Black Women and Legislative Decision-Making and Distinct Identities, Minority Women in U.S. Politics. She's also an editor for the Washington Post's political science blog, The Monkey Cage. Bettye Collier-Thomas is professor of history at Temple University. She is also the inaugural director of Temple's Center for African American History and Culture. She's written several books, including African American Women and the Vote, 1837 to 1965. And she's currently writing about African American women and politics. And Martha Jones is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor, Professor of History, and a professor at the SNF Agora Institute at the Johns Hopkins University. She is the author of The Pathbreaking Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All, as well as Birthright Citizens, A History of Race, Rights in Antebellum America. It's such an honor to welcome this superb panel of scholars, and I'm also thrilled that the moderator for tonight's program is my wonderful colleague, Lana Ulrich, Senior Director of Content at the Center. She does so much to make all of our programming possible. And over to you, Lana.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you to everyone here attending this wonderful seminar. And I'm so looking forward to this conversation with these wonderful scholars we have tonight. So Professor Collier-Thomas, I'd like to start with you, and I'd like to ask you about your landmark volume, African American Women and the Vote, which begins in 1837 with the first anti-slavery convention of American women, which was an interracial gathering of women held in New York to define their roles independent of men in the crucial struggles of that era to end slavery in Southern states and racial discrimination in Northern states. And as your co-author Anne Gordon writes in the introduction, 1837 replaces 1848, which was the year of Seneca Falls, in order to emphasize the preeminency of anti-slavery agitation in the political history of African Americans, including women. And the volume also ends with 1965, which is the passage of the Voting Rights Act. So I wanted to ask if you could just say a little bit more about that crucial date of 1837. Would you say that that is the starting point of the story of Black women's suffrage and representation in America? And why or why not?
I wouldn't say that's the starting point for African American women, but African American women were certainly interested in it. But Lana, first I want to say that we didn't, Anne and I did not author that book. It is an edited work. I was at the Schlesinger Library, and Anne sent me a note and said, could she meet and talk with me? And I said, yes. And she said, what do you think is the most important subject that has not been dealt with in terms of Black women's history and history, period? Now, you have to understand that that was in the 1980s, mid 1980s, when she asked that question. And I said, well, politics. I said, nothing has been written about politics in Black women. She said, well, how can we do? I would like to University of Massachusetts has given me some money, and I have been given the money to do a national conference, and then we want to put together a book. And she said, I don't know anybody in that area. I said, well, I know lots of people. So I mentioned Rosalind Turberg Penn and a number of persons in the field whom I knew were working on different topics. And so that's how that came to be. And we did that national conference, but the papers sat for until, when was that book published? That book was published in the in around 2000, I think, late, yeah. So it was published decades after we had the conference and we had edited the papers. So that's how that book began. So, you know, a lot of that is not original to me. My piece in that book is on Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. And that too was written to be published in 19th century, was it Negro Americans by August Meyer. And that was earlier. And I was invited to write a paper there. And I wrote the paper on Harper and August Meyer. Any of you familiar with August Meyer? Well, August Meyer called me on a Sunday morning and said, Dr. Collier-Thomas, you cannot have 30-some pages on Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Frederick Douglass only received 25. And so I called John Hope Franklin, and he said, yes, that's why nobody knows who she is. And that's why she deserves those pages. And so I said, well, it doesn't have to be there. I was famous for just pulling things. And so I pulled it, and that sat there then until we did that conference. So it was written much earlier. So in terms of 1837, we thought that we should find people and we should trace it through, this history through, from 1837 right on up into the more recent period of that time. And that's what we did. We had no idea that this was going to turn into a major book. But 1837 was a beginning point. But as Lisa Tetrault has explained, and others now who have published so many books, we know far more now than we knew then. But what we wrote, the scholars wrote about Black women, these two were seminal works for all of those people. Some of them were working on dissertations and all kinds of things. So that's how we came to that point. Now, Martha has written in her wonderful book a lot about the transitional period. And both Martha and I wrote about that in our books on women and the church. Okay. Mine, Jesus, Jobs, and Justice, and hers, senior moment, Martha. What is the title?
All Bound Up Together.
All Bound Up Together. I should remember that from Martha. Okay. And so that's how these works came to be. And I think we were, Martha and I were among the first who began to trace the whole question of suffrage and African Americans women struggle with that to the church, which is where it emanated. But not only that, did it emanate from there, but as I argue in Jesus, Jobs, and Justice, the women who become so involved in the suffrage movement, the national suffrage movement, they are these church women. And it's a very involved process. So the ascent of Black women was very different from that of white women. But know ye this, one of the quotes that I sent John was from 1859 from Laura. And I was stunned when I saw that particular piece and quote. I don't know who that woman was, and she was not mentioned, but obviously the people in that period knew. So in 1859, and obviously she was a free Black woman, she makes that statement that said, we are as interested, colored women are as interested in politics as the colored men. That says it all. Colored women, Black women, African-American women, whatever you want to call them then, they were there from the beginning and before the Civil War, concerned about politics, and you see it pulled all the way through. You see their debates in great detail on suffrage, and I have to stop because I do talk a lot. And I don't want to go on, as my husband would say, preaching. I don't want to go on, but you get the picture. So, we can go on with that discussion, but there is a lot there, and we can't put it all in these books.
No,
we can
definitely.
only put pieces.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for clarifying that and for telling the story about that conference. It's just really interesting to hear how that came together, and amazing that it took that long to get that work out there. And you mentioned your research into Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. I know you were telling us the story as well about how you discovered her while you were researching Black newspapers. So I might want to ask you a little bit later on just more about that research and any other figures that you came across during that. So Professor Jones, Professor Collier-Thomas mentioned, your work in this area as well. So feel free to respond to anything that she said and maybe say a little bit more about some of the earlier movements, the importance of the church, the anti-slavery societies, colored conventions, anything else that might help shed additional light in this area.
Well, thanks to you, Lana, for hosting us along with Jeff Rosen in the National Constitution Center. It's a tremendous honor to be here with Dr. Brown and Dr. Collier-Thomas, who has really been far too modest about her own work and the role of the volume that she co-edited on African-American women in the vote. One of the important things that I say about my own evolution as a historian is that I benefited from that volume, from the work of Dr. Rosalind Terborg Penn, because I read this work before I read the major works on, say, Susan Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, right? My introduction to the history of women in the vote came from this path-breaking work on Black women and voting rights. And I consider myself fortunate because, in a sense, I didn't have to unlearn, right, the other histories that were so predominant for far too long. And I thank Dr. Collier-Thomas for including me anywhere in her orbit on this. But it is correct that I think one of the things we share is this strong conviction that you cannot understand the history of Black women's politics if you don't understand Black women's politics in their churches, in their faith communities. And one of the things about that readers of Vanguard are sometimes surprised to discover is that the book begins in church. And it begins in the African Methodist Episcopal Church with a figure, an extraordinary Black woman preacher named Jarena Lee. Now we are in the 1820s, not the 1830s. And I begin with Jarena Lee because it turns out in order for Black women to fully enter, to fully level a claim on American politics, they have to begin with ideas, right? Before you get to the activism, before you get to the organizing, before you get to the interventions, they need a critique, right? They need a view, right, that challenges a political order that countenances racism and sexism and the intersection of the two, and hence Black women's exclusion from politics. So we go back to women like Jarena Lee in the church because that is the crucible, right? That is a critical crucible where Black women are working out a vision for American politics, one that they will champion for a very long time alone, but very importantly in these early years, a critique, right, that begins to make room for them in American politics. And as you allude to, Lana, we will see that manifest, yes, in Black churches, particularly Black Methodist churches in these early years. We will see it manifest in anti-slavery societies. We will see that critique manifest in the political movement that we refer to as the colored conventions. Again and again, Black women coming to the podium, picking up their pens in the anti-slavery and Black press, leveling that critique that says no racism and no sexism in politics. But the church, we can't tell that story without telling the story of Black women in church.
Thank you for that. Professor Brown, please feel free to comment on anything that Dr. Collier-Thomas and Professor Jones have said. Your work focuses a lot on contemporary issues relating to suffrage representation and intersectionality, which Dr. Jones just mentioned. And you also write about Black women voters, but also candidates and representatives, for instance, in your articles and in your book, Sisters in the State House. But before we get to talking a little bit about the current state of representation from your research, just wanted to know if there were if there was anything about the history that's been discussed so far, or any of the figures from the past that speak to you as well. I know in your book you cite, for example, Dr. Anna Julia Cooper. Is there anybody else that you wanted to mention or put on the table too as being central to understanding this history?
Yeah, so I'm very thankful to be able to share space today with colleagues, Professors Bettye Collier-Thomas and Professor Jones, because their work is so canonical for people like me in political science to do this research on Black women's politics, because there wasn't a there. Our foremother, Jewel Prestige, is one of the first Black women to receive a PhD in political science and started studying Black women. And before that, right, there really were not in-depth studies on Black women, period, right? Black women in politics. And as many of the audience will know, political science and history used to be the same field. And then after World War II, political science splits off and becomes this own thing. So much of our origins as political scientists, we owe to historians. But the discipline, the ways that history was enabled to really dig deep and understand the presence of Black Americans in the United States at the founding of our democracy is something that we haven't been able to do quite fully in political science yet. So political scientists stand on the work of people like Professor Collier-Thomas and Professor Jones in order to get us to the stage where we are now. So there would not be scholars like myself or Wendy Smooth, Evelyn Simeon, Nicole Floyd Alexander if we weren't for historians, right? Because there just wasn't much of an understanding that Black women had different political behavior, that Black women had different political views and policy preferences, had different political tactics. So So I share this to say that this is a new field. Black women's studies in politics is new. I wrote the first book on Black women state legislators in 2014, right? So very, very, very recently. Just goes to show that. So bringing in figures like Anna Julia Cooper, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper are people that we know throughout history have been doing Black women's politics. We just haven't talked about them in our discipline of political science. And so I start my classes with this historical look, and I've had just the fortunate opportunity to teach both Professor Collier-Thomas and Professor Jones's work in the beginning of the semester, right? Because my students really need to deeply understand that what we do in political science now, right, since the Voting Rights Act, since Black women have more access to political representation, doesn't mean that Black women just woke up one morning, right, in the 1960s and said, now we're going to engage in politics. But instead, right, Black women have been toiling for political rights and act as activists, as grassroots leaders before the ballot. And that I think it's incorrect to think that Black women's politics, in my own field, subfield of political science, starts only when we're seeing Black women as elected officials or Black women who are casting ballots, right? But as Professors Collier-Thomas and Jones have mentioned, right, this is a long lineage that starts in 1820 and even before. So in my own work, I oftentimes start with Mariah Stewart as someone who is leading a charge as a raced woman, right? And she's talking to audiences about Black women's political concerns very early on. And this is a figure that I honestly would not have known about if it weren't for the work of historians. And I think it's so important that we're having this interdisciplinary conversation today, because there has to be a much more expansive view of what Black women are doing politically. So while we're championing Kamala Harris, the first Black woman VP, we have to understand the shoulders on which she stands.
I am so pleased that you mentioned Julia Prestige, because I stumbled across her at least almost 40 years ago. And I was trying to find out what had been written by political scientists. And I discovered nothing. And I checked again 30 years ago when I arrived at Temple. I said, well, maybe there's more now. Nothing. Until finally, I stumbled across Wendy Smooth. Mm-hmm. And I said, why aren't political scientists writing about Black women in the vote? Well, Prestige makes the point. She was concerned that in political science departments, nothing was taught about Black people in politics, period. And Black women were totally excluded. So I put her at the front in terms of a pioneer, and people don't know her name today. So thank you very, very much for that. And yes, I have all the copies of your work about those states that are going in politics to stay in my next book. So I have you too. Okay. So we want to thank you too for that work.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Professor Brown, too, for your groundbreaking work in this area. So, Professor Collier-Thomas, speaking about, this new history, and, as Dr. Jones and Dr. Brown mentioned, your work in this area and your original research, just going back to, the stories that you told us about looking through these newspapers, discovering Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, you mentioned that these were conventions that were being held across the country that were made up of all Black men, and she was the only woman. She was the only woman there that was speaking and writing. So, I think maybe if you could just say a little bit more about her, how significant it was that you discovered this information about her, and I guess more about, your original research in this area and how you've contributed to help building up this foundation of work around these questions.
Well, first of all, my dissertation was on the Baltimore Black community, 1865 to 1910. It was recommended to me by, I can't think of his last name. He was major scholar at the University of Chicago, Richard, who did slavery in the cities. You know his name? No, I was looking at Martha thinking that she would know his name. But anyway.
Wade,
we can drop
Richard
this
Wade. Yes, I took a course, a research course under him at Emory University. And his thing was that all of us had to do this original research on urban centers, and he wanted Atlanta. He was a visiting professor, so therefore he was looking for us to do the research for him. And so he decided that I should, he wanted me to go through the minutes of the minutes of the city minutes of Atlanta, and track from 1860 up to the turn of the century, the patterns of race and what they were doing. Well, he had to go get permission from the city for me to do that. And they put a table out in the lobby. Now, this is in the days of segregation. Let's make this very clear. When I was doing my master's, we were still in segregation, okay? That was in the 1960s, 1965. And so they put this table in the lobby, and they brought up these big old books. And some of you who have worked in those books, they're like felt, those old books. And it looked to me like the red clay dust of Georgia. And there I was sitting, and all these white people would come and stare at me. And I went page by page and did all these note cards. We didn't have Xerox. We didn't have internet or anything. It was by hand on the note cards. And so I tracked everything that they were doing. And the first thing I saw, they were moving the bodies of Blacks out of white cemeteries. If you were down in what was the downtown area, sitting on a bench after 6 o'clock, they would arrest you and put you on the chain gang for years, free labor. I was just amazed. It opened me up to a whole new world. So from that, when I went to Washington, D.C. to teach at Howard University, following that, then he was one of the people leading the political campaign, and I can't think of who that was either, for the Democrats. And so I went down to his office and I said, I'm working on a dissertation. What should I do a topic on? He said, well, all these cities have been done on race relations and so forth, but nobody has touched Baltimore. And they have done nothing on Baltimore because it's neither Southern nor Northern. The patterns are not clear. And he said, you should do that. And so I said, okay, well, little did I know there was only one article, scholarly article that had ever been written. Nobody had done anything. So I said, well, how am I going to do this? And I said, well, in 1954, you might know, was when they began to microfilm Black newspapers to preserve them. Thousands had already been lost. And so in Baltimore, the Afro-American and several other little newspapers had been, only the Baltimore Afro-American was done, because I had to go to Enoch Pratt Library, and you know what I'm talking about, Martha, Enoch Pratt Library. And when I first went there and I asked, I just thought the library had lots of stuff on Black people. And I said, well, I'm looking for them. They said, we don't have anything on Negroes. And so I was amazed. And so I started with that Baltimore newspaper. And I fell upon these conventions. And these were the conventions that were being held because the South had to try to re-enter the Union. And so here on this stage was this Black woman. I hadn't seen Black women in anything. Well, of course, you didn't have much to see them in at that time. And I said, who is this woman? So therefore, I became cognizant of her and started picking up pieces here and there. And so I started with those newspapers and indexing those newspapers myself. And I was just stunned with the world of information in those newspapers. What was it? The New York Freedman, just a number in that late 19th century. And of course, they expanded into the 20th century. So I picked the pieces, as I put it, all these little pieces on Harper. And I was just blown away with her. And in fact, Nell Irvin Painter heard me give a paper on her at a conference in Miami. And she said, I'm with University of North Carolina Press. I want you to go home and I want you to get that paper typed into me because we're going to publish it. I had a contract coming to Temple to do that work, but I turned because the Lilly Endowment offered me $1 million to do the history of Black women and religion. Go all over the world where my researchers did for that book. So therefore, Harper got set aside. And that paper then that I wrote earlier sat there. And from there then, and from reading those newspapers page by page, I discovered a world and learned everything you could think about Black women and Black people, editorials. And so I started, as I said, typing out and copying this stuff. So now I have a massive archive on all these different subjects. So I know these people in different worlds, you see. Now I don't suggest, and none of my students these days would do that kind of work, okay? But I loved it. You have to love history to do what we do and political science to do what you do. And it is tedious and it's lonely, but that's what you have to do. So that's how I came to Harper. And I have 5 chapters of a book on Harper that has been sitting downstairs now for years. Maybe I'll get back to it at some point with material that people have not used also, but it's hard.
Thank you for sharing that.
Could I
and
chime in? Sorry.
Sure, go ahead, Professor Jones.
Yeah. Because once again, I want to just reveal myself as someone who follows in Dr. Collier-Thomas's footsteps. My book, All Bound Up Together, is titled for a quote from one of Frances Harper's great speeches from the 1860s in the struggles over voting rights and the voting rights for women versus Black women versus white women and more. She is a native Baltimorean, raised by an uncle who's an educator, an activist, and more, an anti-slavery lecturer, a poet. I think for a long time, she got more attention from literary scholars than she did from political historians. But to me, there is no one who better exemplifies Black women's politics in this middle 19th century period, in part because Watkins Harper is one of those figures who teaches us what is distinct about Black women's political vision. And it is that critique of racism and sexism. But when she comes to those meetings, part of what she talks about is not about women's property rights, not even about the vote. She wants to talk about how Black women are being abused in segregated transportation, ejected from ladies' cars, ridiculed, and more. And she really teaches us the ways in which Black women distinctly come to politics through their own distinct experiences and concerns. She goes on to be a great lecturer in the post-war period in the American South. She will continue to be a novelist and raise her own daughter to be an elocutionist. She has a remarkable arc of a life, but for me, she's indispensable for trying to tell this distinct story that I think we're all trying to discover of how Black women particularly come to politics. And Frances Harper is there to tell that story by the 1860s with great eloquence.
We might also add that if you go to the Liberator, you can find extensive information. This is before the war on Harper. Harper was she was a speaker on the platform with many of the people, whites, who were speaking about slavery, enslavement, and that's how she earned her living. So no one has really fully tracked her in the Liberator, let me add. And so if you've got a graduate, a student, or somebody, they should do that. That foregrounds her work that she does after the war. Also, there was a great piece written, I think it was in the AME Christian Recorder, about how Harper was considered an equal as a speaker to Frederick Douglass, but he earned more money, the article went on to say. Okay, that's in the Christian Recorder. And that and they compared her, I can't think of the white woman's name right now, who was considered to be one of the top lecturers of that time. But finally they stopped comparing her because she was in a league of her own.
Great. Yes. And we at the NCC, we've learned a lot about Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, both through, your work, Professor Collier-Thomas, and your advice to us on the exhibit. I know you were one of our advisors. So for anybody in the audience interested in learning more about her, we'll post links in the chat to, we will post the Liberator link to that, as well as links to the 19th Amendment exhibit and some of the online interactives we have, so you can find out more. We have some audience questions, and Professor Brown, I want to tee up one or two to you. Speaking about additional figures, Warren Wolf asks, can we please mention Shirley Chisholm? I know you said you've been doing some research into her. I know Professor Collier-Thomas, I think you may know her, so you could share a little bit too. But Professor Brown, if you want to maybe speak about Shirley Chisholm. And then Charles Morgan asks, where can I find other women in politics that have been overlooked?
Right. So thank you for both of those questions. So I want to start with the latter question first, because I think it's so important that we ask the other question about, like, why don't we know about these women? Why are their histories hidden, or are they hiding in plain sight? And so some of the things that I particularly ask my students to do is walk around and see whose names are on buildings, whose names aren't there. I'm in Georgetown in Washington, D.C., and this is a place where there is so much history, where Black women's names are on buildings, on street corners, right? They're part of our living memories. But we walk past them every day, but we don't spend time figuring out who they are. And if we open our eyes, right, to learn about who these namesakes are, that's just everyday empowerment, right, that we can be engaging in. But that doesn't mean that that's half the story, right? Because there are so many women that we don't know who they are. And that's willful, right? The erasure of marginalized identities, or people that have contrary views to American politics, or portray a different side of America, right? Ask America to live up to its constitutional duties and responsibilities to all citizens, are oftentimes hidden underneath rugs, right? We're not thinking about the women Black women communists, for example, right? We're not thinking about Black women socialists, those that don't uphold American democratic values the way that we want. So I would ask us again to think about, the reasons and why we don't talk about some, and then why there are some that we do, and we don't acknowledge who they are, right, in kind of their fullness. And so to talk a little bit about Shirley Chisholm, yeah, it's so important to mention her name, right? This is the first Black woman who's elected to Congress in 1968, who then turns around and seeks a Democratic Party's nomination for president in 1972, goes on to serve in Congress for many years, retires, and then leads a life of continued public service. The part about Shirley Chisholm that is most, I think, remarkable is that she comes from an educator's background, right? She was a school teacher, someone who defeated a Black Panther, right, civil rights icon for her seat in Congress. But, right, the voters that elected her knew her passion in the community for helping families, for helping children, for helping low-income folks, immigrants like her. And so her passion for people is what voters really embraced. And I think some of this kind of gets divorced from how we idolize her as being this first, right, this trailblazer, but not turning back to the policies and politics that she championed, much of which we see today. Again, this is something that Professor Jones mentioned. Black women's politics often come out of their own lived experiences. So the things that they're fighting for in politics today, much like are rooted in their own lived experiences, how they've experienced the world, the kind of the challenges and troubles that they've seen. And a lot of this, right, again, is wrapped up in the intersectional nodes of racism, sexism, classism, living in a white heteropatriarchal society. But that doesn't diminish Black women's shine, right? They find ways out of no way. And this is the work that I wanted to do, is to show this very strong-willed force of Black women in politics, to put their issues to the fore, right? This is the same thing that Chisholm did. It was not necessarily taking on what the Democratic Party wanted her to take on, but Black men in the Democratic Party who wanted her to take on, to be 100% honest, right? Mm-hmm. It was her conviction of living this life in a Black woman's body, being responsible and responsive to her constituents nationwide, right? Recognizing that there weren't other locales with Black women representatives. And so she represents more than just those that were in her Brooklyn district, right? But thinking about Black women nationwide until Barbara Jordan joins her. And then later on, we see Yvonne Braithwaite Burke join her in Congress. But I also want to mention, I want to wrap up soon to be respectful of time, but that Shirley Chisholm has daughters. Shirley Chisholm has heirs and people that bear the legacy of her political activism and her mantra, right? One in which they can't, disentangle a feminist ideology from a Black ideology, right? Seeing and living in this world as a Black woman requires Black women in politics to speak up using different kinds of tactics. One thing that Shirley Chisholm was really extraordinarily good at was talking to her colleagues, those that sometimes held racist sentiments, people that ordinarily people would say, why are you talking to this person, right? This is a congressperson who believes in segregation. But she would see a kernel of good in someone or a good in their policies and try to work that angle. And that's what Black women in politics do, right? Some of them, they're ideologues, but there's also people who can be ideologues and then also work to bring a consensus to the table, right? And trying to figure out how do we work with people to get a policy passed, particularly, right, when you need a majority, you need a coalition to form things. So Chisholm was really astute in knowing how to do this. Not that she won all the time, not that her tactics weren't without criticism, but it goes back to this Black woman's ethos, right? Of understanding your position through your own positionality and then finding ways to work with others.
You'll be very happy to know one of my former students, her book on Chisholm will be published by Oxford University in the spring. She called me and told me several days ago. Her name is Zinga Frazier.
Oh, yes.
And she's at Brooklyn. So Zinga's book, I was surprised, will be coming out, that she has worked on for 14 years. And so I'm just as proud as I can be of Zynga. And I can promise you it's going to be groundbreaking. But I knew Shirley Chisholm too. If you look in Sisters in the Struggle, you will see a photograph of me with Shirley Chisholm. Shirley Chisholm was very concerned about her constituents. And so she developed policies and a number of things that would impact her people there in New York. Well, in the 1980s, as you had the development of Black museums, then you had all of these storefronts and places that had popped up across the country and called themselves museums. And so she pressured the National Endowment for the Humanities for them to fund programs where these people could apply for grants to do exhibitions, professional exhibitions, and so forth. And so I shared at the National Black Caucus weekend, 3 years, we had a session. Peggy Cooper, a lot of people don't know who I'm talking about now, some do. Peggy Cooper, Shirley Chisholm, and myself on those sessions at the Black Caucus, where we were speaking to, of course, persons from all over the country who were involved in politics. And we were arguing for monies for these institutions. She managed to get the head of the national, not the head of, Joe Duffy was the head of the National Endowment for the Humanities, but the head of one of the particular divisions to fund then these workshops to teach these people, lay people, a lot of them were lay people, how to write a proposal that could be funded. They didn't know how to write the proposals. So she asked me to work with these people. I said, okay. And so I became the person who developed the program and traveled all over the United States to see holes in the wall, to see strange places that they call museum. But she was concerned about the Jamaica, New York Black Museum because they had applied and could not get a grant. And so she then had me come to New York, and I was shocked. She had a long white limousine to pick me up. And I went and talked with all of the heads of these institutions there and worked to help them write those proposals. But then we found out that they could write the best proposals and that NEH were willing to fund a proposal for you to do that, but not to fund a program. And so that became the next issue. So she was into all kinds of things and really worked closely with her people to see that their issues were addressed because she came from the bottom in those women's clubs there in Brooklyn and had worked her way up into politics. And she tells that story in one of her books. You see, I think it's Unbought and Unbossed, one of them. So yes, there's much to be said there. So we look forward to Zynga's book. And we look forward to many others as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, we'll definitely keep an eye out for that book at the NCC and hope to do a program when that comes out. Professor Jones, feel free to add anything more to the discussion about Shirley Chisholm. And in the Q&A, there's a couple other women that have been mentioned as well, including Barbara Jordan, Polly Murray, Fannie Lee Hamer. So, feel free to comment on any of those figures too.
Yeah, these are, the women on whose shoulders Vice President Kamala Harris tells us she stands. These women who are work toward and then work beyond finally the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which for the first time in US history brings Black women and men, right, to the polls relatively unfettered. So partly in our conversation, we began with where does this story begin? One of the misnomers about the history of women in the vote in the US is that it ends in 1920 with the adoption of the 19th Amendment. But for too many Black American women, the 19th Amendment is a disappointment. It is a failure. They remain disenfranchised by Jim Crow laws, by lynching and violence. And so we must tell the story all the way to 1965 and beyond. The great Barbara Jordan from Houston, Texas, the first Black woman from the American South to be elected to Congress, who is there to open the impeachment proceedings in the House of Representatives against President Richard Nixon. It is just a stunning moment in US history, and Jordan knows precisely where she stands, how she got there, and what it means for her to be initiating these charges against the President of the United States. Someone asked about Pauli Murray, a long lifetime of activism from very left party politics, as Dr. Brown pointed to, all the way to her investiture as a priest in the Episcopal Church. I think a real inheritor of the tradition of the churchwomen who we were talking about just a bit earlier. The great Fannie Lou Hamer, who is getting such important attention now with two new books from Dr. Keisha Blaine and Dr. Kate Larson. Hamer is, to me, the sort of figure who understands not only politics and voting rights in the gritty trenches of Mississippi. She understands the television camera. She understands how to bring Black Americans' claims for voting rights to Congress, to the president, to the political parties, but into the living rooms of Americans. And she does so, I think, with almost unparalleled effect. So there are so many women I think we could hold up on an evening like this. These are just some, but I think Vice President Harris is right when she gently but deliberately points us to this chapter in US political history and says, now it is time. If this is not a chapter that you knew, it is time to learn this chapter. And clearly all our work is there for folks to come to and to understand better what the vice president was trying to teach us back in the summer of 2020 when she accepted the Democratic nomination.
Great. Professor Brown, we're just a few minutes away from the end of the program. I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about, your advice to other teachers in schools who want to, teach students about this history. And we also have a question from Drew Benfer, who asks, what guiding questions do you recommend for high school students who are studying the political history of African-American women?
Well, I would love to pick up where Professor Jones stopped. So it's the political history to the modern day. So Professor Jones ends Vanguard with looking at Stacey Abrams and her legacy that's building really upon women like Fannie Lou Hamer, right? So there are stories that women like Fannie Lou Hamer who have lost, right? Fannie Lou Hamer does not get elected to Congress, right? She runs, she tries to have the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party set, doesn't happen, right? And that's where her story could have ended, but it doesn't. We remember her the same way we remember Stacey Abrams, whose story could have ended when she lost the 2018 gubernatorial race. And now we see that she has a much longer political life. And so I would push us to think about these connections and how for Black women's politics, what looks like a loss is not a loss, right? Black women are like a phoenix, right? We rise from the ashes, right? There's things that Black women keep fighting for because the politics aren't done. The job isn't over. And so I would suggest that high school students learn from the work of Professor Jones, Professor Collier-Thomas, much of which is super accessible, right? It is written in ways that lay people can read and understand them. Political science, not so much, unfortunately. But my own work is ethnographic, it's qualitative, right? It leads with the narratives of Black women who are running for office and are serving in office, not to bring voice to the powerless, right? Not to speak, not to amplify the voices of people that don't have a microphone, but to shape them in ways that are recognizable to political scientists. So if I were looking to create text for high school students, I would start with some of these more narrative-based approaches, as opposed to kind of leading with these quantitative methods that are really heavy in statistics and having to have a background in advanced methods that many high school students don't have.
Thank you so much, Professor Collier-Thomas, Professor Jones, and Professor Brown, for such an illuminating and interesting and deep conversation on this important topic. I'm sorry that we have to close. I hope to continue this conversation with future programming. And for all of you who joined tonight, thank you so much for being here. We'll post this video on our website. We'll also podcast the audio out. So that will come out on our podcast, and all of the resources that were posted to the chat will be available on our website as well, in case you're interested in learning more. Thank you again. Have a good evening, and we'll see you at the next program. Take care.